Lecture 9. Immobile and Dynamic Thinking, Orthodoxy and the Intellectuals. We have tried to analyze the symptoms of defensive maneuvers in thought, the typical symptoms present in many intellectual tendencies, but especially in every kind of orthodoxy. I have also explained why I am doing this. Every human being speaks, lives, and operates within a concrete life, and I have no reason, even at the lectern, to pretend that we are trying to locate an absolute truth in absolute space. Instead, our task is to carry out the sociological concretization of our own situation. In the beginning, in this introduction, it may be the task, in order to build a basis for mutual understanding, for me to point out the barriers to entry which might increase actual misunderstandings by 1,000-fold, and which may be removed by taking the obstacles as theme. I naturally do not pretend that I am necessarily in the right. It is my task to give utterance to what everyone senses, and we can discuss afterwards whether I'm right and how these difficulties may be overcome. I have shown how political circumstances produce and compel the growth of orthodoxies in certain situations, and I have yet to discuss the relative inevitability of such things. First, I had the task of showing you an ideal image of a dynamic kind of research, carried forward by the intellectual instincts, and to provide you with the characteristics of such committed thought. I have collected a few of its most visible marks, together with the counter-arguments to it, and I have thus far systematized and presented the following remarks of the orthodoxy mode of thinking, or let us say of all modes of thinking that characterize the defensive maneuvers of the opposition. I repeat, as we have often experienced, the most primitive form of defensive maneuver consists of asking, quote, "What is that? I want the labels," end quote. I have shown how this comes with most frequently from colleagues in the discipline who are unready to accept the new science, who reject the whole problem situation and seek to impede it by the petty tactic of demanding the label. We have already established this as the most elementary way of rejecting a newly emerging matter. An elaboration of this maneuver consists in saying, as one starts to think, that it follows from the concept of science that this thing is impossible. But that shows simply that the concept of science was grounded in past achievements, and thus that the defects of inadequacy in the apparatus invoked for assistance become ever more apparent. What is decisive for the sociology of knowledge is that the deeper one goes, the more radical and dangerous is the rejection. Trivialization can be met by counter-trivialization. But if the other has principles, the hidden defensive maneuver is not so easily seen. The sociology of knowledge must then bring those principles into question by means of a loosening move. This is an essential function of the sociologist of knowledge. For all values and problems raised, he must inquire into the concreteness of the worldview, into the secret will governing the thought apparatus, in order no longer to leave these things hidden, but to identify himself with. This is a conscious reception, a conscious self-identification. The thinker consciously identifies himself with his thought apparatus, but not in an unconscious way. The sociology of knowledge prepares the way for a new phase of thought because it teaches how to carry through the loosening movement of thought, and in a situation in which discussion is no longer possible, makes such discussion nevertheless possible to a degree. There are two forms of defensive maneuver. Quote, "That is dangerous," says every party. One does not say, quote, "That is true," or "That is untrue," but, quote, "That is a danger to this or that," end quote. I have conceded that such a statement of the problem is valid from a political standpoint, but to think this way too long means failure at the emergence of important new discoveries. That is the greatest danger. I admit that it is hardly possible today to express a thought that is not somehow politically relevant, a danger to someone. Whether there is any action that is ethically indifferent was already a question in classical antiquity. In this ethical worldview, everything is ethically relevant. In a political world, everything is politically relevant. Everything is to be included, and from worldviews to ethics, everything has a dangerous side. If there were nothing present but this criterion, any productive movement in thinking would come to a halt. If we want to see clearly what is of use and what is of harm, then I deny that one must be confined to this point of view. The tactic of opening up the intellectual apparatus avoids the danger of all dogmatism, which allows a system to become fixed at a certain stage. The third danger of this structure, to be opposed, is its operation with overly narrow and rigid categories. I have tried to show how much cognitive value there is in the confrontation between bourgeois and proletarian thinking in Marxism, but how dangerous it is if one applies this slogan without thought and ultimately rejects everything to be found in the bourgeois world, never asking whether certain things do not abstract themselves from what is bourgeois and whether they cannot consequently be taken along. This is the danger of an overly restrictive categorical apparatus. In Marxism, certain stabilization techniques are manifesting themselves through the party apparatus, but these should be combated from the opposite pole within the party. There are dangerous dogmas that, although they may once have had productive meanings which we can articulate more precisely today, can under certain circumstances become a danger to thinking and knowing. The example to be cited here is the notion of the proletariat as bearer of the world spirit. In itself, something valid is happening when one acts in the consciousness of having been chosen. This arises out of the chiastic spark of this thought, but it implies simultaneously a certain determinism in outlook. An example of such a combination is the notion that the world history is working for us, and that we are the vanguard in step with what has been determined to happen. Total opposition and determination by a group fully excluded from the regulation of things in the world gain a flaming beacon in the feeling of wanting to break the world apart in the name of the world spirit, and in the belief that the world spirit is working for them. The odd thing is that this intellectual configuration allows no room for freedom, for the fact that man chooses a situation for himself. When a bourgeois observes this, he is frightened by the fact that this is a determinism and that the basic theme of bourgeois thought has no place in it. That one finds oneself in step with the world means that the thing works by itself. It is interesting that the bourgeois should take such a stand, since if he did want to identify himself with this orthodoxy, he would do it out of his situation of choice. Although the proletarian is not placed in a situation of choice, the absence of freedom is no restraint for him because he is in step with his situation with which he has identified himself. As proletarian strata commingle with strata for which the situation of choice would be available, the gap in the system that has been present for the bourgeois also opens up for them. At the moment when the situation of choice emerges, a place opens within the life of the individual where he must decide and move from freedom to necessity. Considered abstractly, the problem of man having to come of necessity to a decision at some point exists for the determinist as well, if he is not to become a revisionist. This situation is also not surrendered in original Marxism. It is our task to move it to the center of attention. I just wanted to develop this line of reasoning in order to show that this chiastic feeling of having been chosen contains a very subtle set of problems, which may be simply expressed by saying that determinism has the feeling of finding itself in step with the world, but that the more concrete this situation becomes, the harder it is to sustain determinism as a worldview, and the notion that the best chance for understanding the truth lies in the doctrine of being a priori in step with the world belongs to the mechanisms of repression. The danger arises of being unable to master newly appearing insights and developments that must always emerge in life. The situation of imagining that we have the key to the universe in our hand may well turn into an intellectual complacency that one should oppose in one's own party. That is why I have transmuted the doctrine of being chosen into a doctrine of the best chance. A chance has to be seized, it can be lost. There is no doubt that the proletariat has the best chance for understanding the social structure. It is necessary to arm oneself against the loss of that chance. It is essential somehow to reach with candor everything that comes up. One may well ask about the political consequences of a thing, but one may not execute a defensive maneuver before the thing has even been taken in. One might say that the most important hallmark of the bias inherent in any thought and present as the essential characteristic of orthodoxy is intellectual defensiveness. a maneuver that answers every proposal with, "We absolutely will not do this." One of my collaborators recently said that one can fight against this quite easily if one watches the opponent. I do not find mistakes in myself. These I do not see. If I want to control myself, just as with Freud's experience of death, then the reflected rays from others gain the power to reveal that I could be like that myself. It is important that these problems be specified. Discussions can proceed quite differently if one can distinguish these defensive maneuvers in the discussion itself. Today's discussions consist of everyone simply absconding from his own small boxing ring, leaving the other just standing there. If there is any one task set for us, it is to create, so far as possible, a platform for a possible exchange of views, a platform for a material discussion. Footnote 46. For the concept of real discussion, see Mannheim, Ideology and Utopia, where he credits it to the Marxist conception of theory and practice. The term cannot be simply translated as, quote, realistic discussion, because the realism encompasses the limits of discussion too, so that there is a strong element of bargaining. The concept is expressly developed against the liberal conception of Parliament as a, quote, platform for rational discussion. See Kettler and Meha, Mannheim and the Crisis of Liberalism, pages 101 to 102 and 171. In contrast to thought impaired by defensiveness, the thinking that I want to call non-orthodox is distinguished by the following. Like reality, it is in motion, and not only by taking in new contents, but also by broadening its basis in thought. Consider the example of the natural sciences. There, if one has models of thought and sets of axioms with which one cannot comprehend new facts, one discards the old basic system without qualms to accommodate the new data. Where the individual is not politically bound, he faces nothing but obstacles that can be overcome by the fruitfulness of his experiments. In political life, however, things are not given up merely as fact to be registered, but as tied up with a volition that is in fact also attached elsewhere, and that must be liberated when one sees that this attitude is impeding orientation to the world. Thought that is truly free participates in this movement by returning to fundamentals. The second technique, more difficult to enact, is where one sees that one's intellectual points of departure all originate in a point that is particular. At the moment when volitions meet, when localities and regions, not to speak of classes and status groups, that had separately formed certain views for themselves, converge in a common stream, the opportunity presents itself of seeing that each locality, each status group, each class lived in only a corner of the world, that each was particularly oriented towards a distinctive axiomatic set, and that none of them was absolute. The basic structural logic of every human being is to see his particularity as absolute. The new insight may mark the first stage of a cosmopolitan situation. Certain ways of thinking take form in certain stages of life, and this movement may present the stage at which it is possible to confront diverse developments. What I have been attempting to carry into effect is to use this situation in order to move in the direction of such a possibility. I do not know what will come of this, but the opportunity is presented by the convergence of these biases. Uninhibited thinking that does not blockade itself is obliged to revise its attitudes at such a moment. It should not be thought that being tied to interests invariably makes one blind. Under certain circumstances, they may make for clear-sightedness, especially for another's character. Envy and love, like other bonds affecting one's being, can make a person clear-sighted. One must ascertain how the particular views can be fitted into the enlarged plan of the comprehensive framework. I cannot deny that one must search gropingly in this direction, that one starts by becoming more uncertain, but that is inseparable from the situation. Yet man would rather know it all than think. Now I want to direct your attention to the highly important positive valuation of orthodoxy, which nevertheless has its limits, and from these latter I can show you, after pointing out the dangers inherent in orthodoxy, what comprises its relative justification. The political doctrine of theory and practice has a splendid insight, namely that no image of the world that fails to eventuate in a specific type of political practice can be fruitful. Footnote 47. In Mannheim's usage in general, the political doctrine of theory and practice refers to George Lucas's version of Marxism. Mannheim's rather one-sided dialogue with Lucas, in his Marxist phase, dates to his first semester as tutor in Heidelberg, when he conducted a workshop on history and class consciousness. See the discussion of Lukács on theory and practice in Ideology and Utopia, pages 110 to 111. See below the protocol of a seminar on Lukács that Mannheim conducted jointly with Alfred Weber. Okay, a decision about the world which offers direction, but because it remains contemplative and inhibits decision, is politically useless, according to this doctrine. Here, too, I want to allow my opponent to encroach upon me as far as possible. That is my duty. Now, I want to admit right away that the most difficult point about my kind of thinking is that, at least at first, it suspends decision. That is inevitably implicated in this position. As soon as I establish the point about the particularity of standpoints, I will continue to do what I have been doing, regardless of my standpoint, but I will put off any sort of decision. The project cannot be carried out except under the sign of a suspension of the final act in deliberation, the will to action. I admit that it is necessary to have a consonance between theory and practice in a worldview, which must be directed towards the deed. My solution, rather than being unswervingly self-enclosed, is ambivalent. It is a theory that has a theoretical man in front and a practical man within. These things do not coincide. They seek for one another and want to meet, but they are not destined to match one another, as in every theory that is genuinely political. It is, however, an illusion to think that, as a fact of matter, political practice is so unbroken, even in Marxism, as events follow their actual course. How could one succeed in bringing about a self-enclosed theory without ambivalence? The real situation will constantly disrupt it. Only in its ideal type is a system always self-enclosed. You can observe this in yourself whenever you attempt to classify people. Classification is always difficult. It is always possible to classify a person ambivalently. It is always a question of making a choice. Life in its enactment is also ambivalent. I will shortly show that the character of its ambivalence. Orthodoxy is evidently suffering a crisis of ambivalence at the present time. Or why would they listen to what I say? And why would it unsettle them? Only because it is recognized that the proletarian situation must possess two qualities. First, unambiguous guidelines for action and decision, guidelines that may not be disturbed. And second, it is necessary to be at the height of right consciousness. And this cannot be as readily guaranteed as the militancy of the political will. Even within the party, two tendencies oppose one another. On the one side, a group maintaining that the firm contours of the theory, the decisiveness of the willed course, not be rendered uncertain by a wide expansion of outlook, by calling into question things that one should not reflect on, lest the decision be lost in the process. On the other side, a group in the party urging that to cooperate in discussions with nothing but slogans causes the disappearance of the cognitive value present in the theoretical elements. The ambivalence experienced by the individual in himself functions in the party in the guise of distinct groups. You will grant that there are in fact two groups constantly struggling with one another in the party. We shall depict them schematically. First, the intelligentsia that seeks to expand beyond this framework of orthodoxy in order to guarantee an enlarged view, and thus to avoid the loss of realistic consciousness. And second, the other group that is prepared to sacrifice realistic consciousness, but not the unwavering aim and lack of ambiguity in the purposes of political decision. Ambivalence is actually split up in this way. You can see it in large organizations, but also in smaller spheres of life. Sociology has the task of shedding light on man's reasons for loving or hating, and on the ways in which the experience of the individual functionalizes itself in large groups. What we have identified as ambivalence in the individual is a vital ambivalence in humankind. I would like to say that it is not possible to answer yes or no to the question whether one should decide in favor of decision or expansion, i.e. self-expansion. One cannot, in fact, proceed other than dialectically. It depends first on the phase we are in, and second on the group with which we identify ourselves. First, some points about the phase. In a situation of the deed, a moment of decision, in my view, one can do nothing but to carry through orthodoxy's step, to fix the sphere in place, and to carry through in actual fact an unambiguous step on behalf of life. Life requires the ambivalence of both the posture of searching and, at the moment of attack, the stage of decision as well. The party requires this too. I would like to say that orthodoxy always becomes the decisive spiritual element at the moment when the necessity for action is unconditionally given. Its function is always to guarantee a decision. It must be in charge at such a moment. Its supremacy is temporarily the truth. But even in the party of orthodoxy, a self-relaxation must take place. The formal rigidity must be suspended. Whenever there is breathing space, where things are not at the stage for striking out. In these phases, the elements whose functioning I find in the intelligentsia must be taken up. The intelligentsia are not a god, and they do not hold the truth in their hands. But the point is that within the parties, no matter where they stand, they usually have the mission of fulfilling this task of the hour, which is the expansion, loosening, seeking. From the recognition of this ambivalence, the position which I represent, the absolutizing of searching and loosening, comes to know its own limits. At this point, I concede a relative justification to the necessity for a type of orthodoxy. I recognize my own limitations. It is possible to admit that certain things could not be sought, that certain things could not be carried through without being reprimitivized. The turning back to fascism from this level of unconstrained thinking is possible only on an interpretation that the solution is perhaps a part of life. With this, however, one gives up the autonomous movement of one's own life. The problem whether this solution may not belong to life, to the structural logic of society, emerges impressively in Nietzsche. This is the move in the direction of truth in fascism. He starts out by finding the fascist solution, then he recognizes the possibility of a second solution, vis-a-vis that without self-abandonment, or the surrender of one's dignity as thinker, one can make this second kind of regression, the orthodox stabilization of volitional decision, visible to certain groups, with all its self-limitation and self-enclosure. Footnote 48. The syntax is awkward here, and it's impossible to be certain that Mannheim imputes the second solution to Nietzsche as well. The whole paragraph is remarkable because Mannheim shifts without notice from the discussion of the activist and orthodox moment in socialism to fascism, perhaps in reprise of his early characterization of Mussolini's shift. This discussion should be read not only in light of Mannheim's struggle with Marxist colleagues, students, and models, but also in view of his complex relationship to Hans Freuer. See Loder and Hitler, Sociology as Political Education. I guess that's this volume. End of Lecture 9.